Number 3, the Christian contends hard for grace. Note that I did not say he contends hard for religion. We're not talking about inquisitions and crusades when we're talking about our battle to make sure, or Paul's battle to make sure that grace is first and foremost in everything that is taught to his disciples and to every other disciple. We're talking about extending grace and blocking attempts to shift it or corrupt it or pervert it. See, it's grace that Paul is contending for. In our title, we're not striving to get grace, we're striving to make sure that grace maintains its preeminent role in our faith. So as we move into chapter 2 of Galatians, that's the doctrinal truth that Paul says is absolutely critical. That after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem because of a revelation and set before them the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So we've leaped forward now in Paul's testimony. He says, after 14 years of fulfilling my calling of preaching the gospel to Gentiles, this revelation that God gave me, I went back up to Jerusalem. So this is all after the first missionary journey. And he says, I went back to Jerusalem because I wanted to make sure that what I was teaching was not contrary to what the rest of the apostles were teaching. That's what he means by in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. So this was an effort to ensure that we were all teaching the same thing. But of course, that's not what this whole encounter turns into. Verse 4, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. See, Paul flips a switch there in verse 4. It's no longer this nice little story of him going from one event to the next following Jesus. Now there's an edge, there's a hard edge to the narrative. There are false brothers, he says, secreted in. There's some sort of conspiracy or plot to bring down what he's striving for. And what he's saying is, if that truth goes, the truth of the gospel goes, then your freedom is gone. You're a slave again to the law, is what he says. If that truth, that freedom, the power, the love, and the liberation of the gospel of grace are all gone. So we must strive for it. We must strive for grace, because it is grace, not works, that saves, and that matters. See, the true Christian knows how much grace matters. Grace is what drove Martin Luther to say, here I stand and I can do no other. Salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And Paul says, if we don't have grace, if we don't have that truth, then we don't have freedom at all. And we're slaves again. And so he says, I didn't yield to them for a moment. I can just imagine how stubborn Paul was in those conversations. He contends hard for grace. That's how important this is, because the gospel, the true gospel, needs nothing more. It certainly doesn't need our help. Before I go any further in all of this, I skipped something in that passage, and I need to go back and look at it because I think perhaps it's the most important phrase in this entire chapter, in chapter 2. And all, maybe in the, well, I don't know if I'd say the whole book of Galatians, but definitely in chapter 2. Paul says, I went to Jerusalem in front of all these influential church leaders, and he says, and those who seemed influential, Peter, Paul, James, they were all there, they seemed influential, added nothing to me. In other words, I had the full, complete gospel, and there's nothing else that they could have added that would have made it better, that would have made it more complete. It was complete. The message that I was going to confirm with them was entirely complete. They added nothing to it. And at first, it seems like it's such a snarky statement, but it's not. And remember what we talked about last week in our introduction to Galatians. There were these false teachers, and they had derailed the Galatian church. And now in verse 4 of chapter 2, he says there were false brothers who were spying and trying to ruin freedom in Christ. So you have to understand the nature of the conflict here. See, he's not confronting a false religion, although I guess in a way he is. But it's not an organized false religion. He's not saying that these people were saying, no, Jesus is not the way, the truth, and the life. That's not what they were saying. In fact, what they were saying was far more dangerous than that. What they were saying was something along the lines of, believing in Jesus is just fine, but you need a little something more. Believing in Jesus isn't quite enough. And isn't that what we see in every modern permutation and every cult of Christianity of the 19th, 20th, 21st century? Believing in Jesus isn't quite enough. You need Jesus and what we've added to it. In Acts chapter 15, we see that the whole problem that Paul is caught up in here with the Galatians is laid out to us historically. These teachers get up in verse 1 of chapter 15 and they say, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Paul says, these were false brothers who snuck in to spy out our freedom. They were inside the church. Yeah, they were. They were welcomed into the fellowship, but they were false brothers, Paul says, false Christians. Why? Why does he say that? Because they were saying, oh yeah, you have to believe in Jesus, but you have to add obedience to the law. You're not really saved. You're not fully a Christian. You're not completely acceptable by only believing in Jesus. And we have those echoes still today, as we said. See, the issue isn't one of morality. That's not what's being discussed here. Yes, if we come into Christ, then yes, we want to honor him by keeping ourselves pure. That's a morality clause. This isn't about the moral law that's being discussed here. This is about ceremonial law. This is about customs and traditions. The argument isn't about doing things that are morally right. It's about doing things that show you're set apart, that you're different. That's what all ceremonial laws do. That's all they do, by the way, is set you apart. In the Old Testament, all of those laws are laid out. Don't eat certain foods. Don't wear certain fabrics. I would be in violation of every single one of those laws literally every day, I think, if I were forced to follow them. It goes on and on. There was literally hundreds of things in the ceremonial law that set Jews apart and also served to remind them how far they fell short of God's standard. But in Hebrews, it says this about the ceremonial laws. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifice are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. These are all these regulations on the body, but your conscience still knows, even if you follow all of those regulations, you're still not pure before God. And Paul says, I know, in Romans, he says, I know that following the law can never save me. Your guilt is atoned for if you follow all of these laws, but you still carry the shame with you. Even the sacrifices were imperfect sacrifices because they had to be done over and over and over again. Hebrews goes on, he says, the author says, but when Christ has offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down, he's finished. That's what's implied there by sitting down at the right hand of the Father. It's all done, never to be done again. There will be no more sacrifices. It's done. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. What do you see in that suggests we need Jesus and something else that we do? He sat down. The work is finished. He sits. In Colossians 1:22, we have this astounding language. He has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If you understand your nature, as Lisa pointed out, we speak the language of sin as native speakers. And this language says, you are above reproach before him. So this is Paul's argument in that council. If that's true, then those laws that you're trying to get everyone to do have been utterly and absolutely fulfilled in Jesus Christ. How could you go back to them and try and fulfill yourself more? You are above reproach already. He's reconciled you. And by doing so, he's flipped this old way on its head, right? There's no more accusations against you. You can't be defiled, is what that says. Because it's done once for all time. So you've been made holy, you've been set apart, you've been blameless. The other side of the ceremonial laws is to set you apart. It says you've already done that if you've accepted Jesus Christ. He has set you free from all of that by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. So Paul is saying, if you add anything to Jesus Christ as a requirement for being clean, you are saying the cross can only do so much. The rest is up to me. And so this is why this issue was so important. It was important enough for Paul to stand firmly and say, we didn't give in an inch to them, nor will I ever, is basically the implication that Paul is saying. Because it becomes another form of slavery, another form of bondage. That's what they were attempting to do. Spy out our freedom and make us slaves to the law again. And if you're in slavery, you are not, by definition, experiencing the liberation that the Spirit brings. This is why nothing can be added. It's all faith in Christ, period. Anything else destroys our freedom.